He was the first to see the vessel, a hulking silhouette drifting across the endless void like a massive tombstone in space. Lieutenant Aaron Vega, scanning the star-riddled darkness from the observation deck of the scout ship Caliburn, felt an instant chill upon laying eyes on it. Sensors had detected an anomalous blip for days, but the source had evaded them until this moment. The silent shape that had finally emerged was riddled with cracks, its once sleek exterior marred by the ravages of time. It was clearly not human in origin. Captain Seraphine Beckett ordered the Caliburn to approach with caution, engines humming with restrained power. An uneasy atmosphere settled over everyone aboard. It was not the first time the crew had encountered an abandoned vessel. Explorers often stumbled upon derelicts from failed human missions or rogue cargo ships, but there was a quality to this craft that suggested something else. Every sensor reading they received came back scrambled, as though an invisible haze of static clung to it. Even the ship's shape suggested unfamiliar technology. It was impossibly large, with spires and bulges that soared in unnatural angles. It reminded Beckett of dark cathedrals she had seen in old Earth photographs. They had been charting portions of the galaxy unexplored by human eyes, venturing beyond established star routes in search of new resources and possible colonies. Their mission was routine, but this discovery gave them pause. Perhaps it was the craft's near-Trojan position among asteroids, or the strange, unidentifiable composition of its hull. But some primal dread filled them as they drifted closer. No one was ready to be the first to step aboard, yet they all knew it would have to be done. Vega led the boarding team, accompanying two engineers, San Lee and Marcus Hill, and the ship's medic, Carmen Estrada. A vast docking port on the derelict's side appeared partially open, as though it had been forcibly pried apart from within. They found it a feasible entry point. When their shuttle bumped gently against the alien hull, they confirmed minimal gravity within the craft, enough for magnetic boots to work. The shuttle's hatch hissed open. Unease knotted in their stomachs as they stepped out into the darkness, beams of light piercing the cold void. Once inside, they discovered that an ancient, flickering emergency power system still faintly illuminated parts of the corridors. The flickers were nearly imperceptible, casting long, twisted shadows and then swallowing them in blackness. Hill whistled under his breath. The interior was massive, the corridors vaulted and lined with what looked like twisted pillars. Symbols ran in neat rows across the metallic walls. Now and then, something akin to a stained glass panel was embedded here and there, each one depicting bizarre geometric patterns. The panels looked almost religious, or at least ceremonial. Lee ran her gloved hand along the metallic surface, almost reverently, and shuddered when her suit's sensors registered unusual electromagnetic fluctuations. Estrada, unaccustomed to the oppressive quiet, whispered a comment about the stale air. A thorough scan indicated the presence of atmosphere, but spiked with traces of unknown compounds. The team knew they would have to keep their helmets on. Although they had come armed, they found no signs of any living thing. Still, the sense of being watched was overpowering. As they moved deeper, they discovered sealed doors that curved seamlessly into the structural design. Some had intricate inscriptions that gracefully spiraled from top to bottom. Others bore deep gashes, as though something had clawed through with near maniacal force. Then they reached a cavernous chamber lined with pods. At first glance, it resembled a cryo-spiritual bay, only these pods were shaped more like vaults. Each one had an ovular window revealing incomprehensible electronics inside. A cluster of them lay shattered, their contents missing. One had strange hominid bones strewn at its base, brittle and ancient, albeit with certain inhuman features, elongated skulls and extra joints. Estrada knelt, shining her light on the skeletal remains. The others exchanged worried glances. Communications back to the Caliburn were patchy. The connection crackled heavily as they reported the find to Captain Beckett, who told them to remain cautious. The team pressed on. Something about the corridor beyond the pod chamber felt claustrophobic. Although its width was easily 4 times a human body's span, the walls bent inward in a spiral pattern, giving an optical illusion of movement. Footsteps echoed strangely, making them think they were not alone. At times, sound reverberated back in a way that resembled faint whispers. Eventually, these echoes morphed into distinct voices, unintelligible but present. Hill glanced over his shoulder, again and again, trying to spot whoever might be behind them, only to see emptiness. Even Vega, stoic by nature, felt his humanity trembling under an unseen gaze. They reached what they presumed was the command center, or some equivalent. It featured a large dais in the middle, ringed by flickering panels and cryptic control interfaces. Sweeping arcs of what looked like sculpted steel extended from the floor, not quite meeting overhead, and each arc had alien script etched upon it. The looming sense of trespass thickened. Then, with almost torturous slowness, the lights in the room brightened to a dull glow. Some mechanism was responding to their presence. Lee approached one of the surviving panels, carefully removing a portable interface from her pack. As she worked to decode the system, the rest of the team fanned out, examining the environment. One side of the chamber opened into a large viewport of it. They glimpsed the scattered asteroid field and the faint glimmer of distant stars. The view was strangely unsettling, dominated by swirling cosmic dust that created illusions of shifting shadows. In that cosmic interplay of light and darkness, Vega thought he saw an enormous shape drift past, but when he blinked, it was gone. Lee's abrupt gasp drew everyone's attention. Her interface was rapidly scrolling with information. Through partial decoding, she had accessed fragments of data, something akin to logs. She managed to glean that the ship belonged to a species advanced beyond humanity's current technology, and they had harnessed energies that defied comprehension. Something had gone wrong, violently so. The logs were riddled with mentions of an entity. That was the only word the translator could consistently display. It was described as older than the stars, a force that thrived on mental energies. The species had attempted to contain it, or perhaps worship it. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber flickered again, this time violently. A wave of invisible pressure seemed to flood the place, causing the metal arcs to ring with a disturbing hum. A dark presence crept into each of their minds, a seeping, chilling awareness. They felt an echo of something that did not come from them. Distorted images, twisted faces, screaming alien figures, swirling corridors, and worst of all, a huge, cavernous maw in endless blackness. Then it was gone. Estrada collapsed to her knees, panting. Hill clutched at his helmet, stumbling. Vega felt cold sweat bead on his forehead. Lee's interface snapped off. Anguished static surrounded them. Something in that moment seemed to awaken. With a fearful urgency, Vega urged the others to retreat to the shuttle. Yet the path back was not as they had left it. The corridors shifted, or perhaps it was their perception that changed. Darkness pooled in corners that their suit lights could not penetrate. Once straight passageways now curved or conjoined in labyrinthine patterns. Disquieting whispers slithered through the air. Mighty questioned if the ship itself was reconfiguring. The battered bones they had spotted earlier had vanished. They tried to re-establish contact with Captain Beckett, but heard only a hoarse thrum. They turned a corner and found themselves in a dimly lit chamber they had not come across before, with high-vaulted ceilings and lines of crypt-like pods arranged in neat rows. Ancient banners, or tapestries, draped from the ceiling, discolored by centuries of decay, symbols repeated in mesmerizing patterns, weaving into geometric labyrinths that seemed to shift under scrutiny. Vega's pulse hammered. The entire environment felt like a tomb, or worse, a shrine meant for the worship of something dreadful. A dull scrape echoed nearby. The beam of Lee's flashlight caught a fleeting motion. A shape elongated and hunched, sliding behind a row of pods. Hill raised his weapon, shouting a warning that remained unanswered. They moved cautiously, hearts pounding. Then, A faint whisper rang through their comms, a voice deep and resonant, speaking in a language they didn't understand. Its undertone held a malevolence that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. "We're not alone," Lee whispered. The shape revealed itself, stepping into the flickering glow. It was vaguely humanoid, yet clearly not human. A skeleton wrapped in thin, leathery tatters, mouth twisted in a permanent grimace. Empty sockets glowed with a dull red haze. It lurched forward with unnatural speed. Before they could retaliate, it vanished once more into the shadows, almost as though it were never truly there. Hill let out a ragged gasp, scanning for any sign of it. The atmosphere thickened with dread. From behind a pillar, another figure appeared, half of its body missing, only to blink out, like a disturbed hologram. More ephemeral shapes manifested in the corners of their vision, some missing limbs, others contorted in ways that defied anatomy. Estrada cried out, stumbling back against one of the pods. Her breath came in terrified rasps. The flickering illusions were real enough to terrify, but intangible, spectral echoes of the species that once occupied this place. The sense of intrusion grew. They were in a temple, and the deity was stirring. Heedless of the phantoms, Vega resumed leading an escape. The corridors twisted until they found another route, possibly back to the docking bay. The hull's architecture groaned as gravity fluctuated, dust and debris shifting. They navigated by the faint glow of emergency lights and suit lamps, ignoring the dancing apparitions in their peripheral vision. And then, somewhere deeper in the ship, a resonant moan rumbled, both physical and psychic. The entity's presence poured forth, flooding their minds with alien anguish and monstrous fury. They realized too late, if this god or demon was enthralled here, it had reawakened. Now it was feeding off their terror. They found a chamber with massive swirling doors that parted automatically, revealing a broad corridor leading, they hoped, back to the docking port. Snarled cables and filaments dangled from the ceiling. Some glowed with residual energy, pulsing in a heartbeat rhythm. When the team stepped across the threshold, something slammed behind them. One of the swirling doors clamped shut. They were locked in. Ahead of them lay a pulsing darkness. The corridor widened, extending into a labyrinth, lit by a strobing glow. Ghostly figures drifted along the edges, distorted faces pressed out from behind the walls as though trying to escape their metallurgic prison. Voices hissed in a cacophony, calling the intruders deeper. The team pressed on, adrenaline fueling their shaky determination. Then, to their mute horror, they spotted a gaping fissure in the floor leading to a lower deck. Strange screams echoed from the chasm. Overcoming revulsion, they skirted the ledge until a fleeting glimmer of light ahead gave them renewed hope. Finally, the docking port was in sight. It was battered, but their shuttle loomed there, or so it seemed. The corridor behind them erupted with movement. Countless shapes swarmed, no longer as faint apparitions but in half-corporeal form, screeching alien war cries or prayers. Blood-red gleams burned in some of their eyes. Hill, trembling, aimed his gun to fire warning shots into the darkness. The muzzle flared, but the shapes only parted and reformed. Something knocked him down with bruising force. His weapon skittered away. Estrada and Lee scrambled to help him up, terror fueling their every step. Vega urged them onward, waving them toward the shuttle. Their footsteps tapped an urgent staccato as they descended the short ramp. Once on board, Vega sealed the hatch, breathing heavily. The docking clamps hissed, taking what felt like an eternity to disengage. Outside the small cockpit window, swirling shadows pressed against the glass as though longing to breach the shuttle's barrier. The clamps finally released, and with a shudder, the shuttle broke free. The ancient port drifted away behind them. Relief was short-lived. When the shuttle reattached to the Caliburn, they discovered the malevolence had followed them. Captain Beckett demanded answers. Even from the landing bay, the crew sensed that something about the entire scout ship felt off. Dim lights flickered erratically, and repeated overhead announcements garbled themselves. The entity's psychic swirls had bled through the hull, embedding themselves in the Caliburn's systems. Unseen footsteps resonated in empty corridors. Doors opened unprompted, and half-seen silhouettes watched from junctions. Beckett moved quickly to gather everyone on the bridge. She insisted on hearing every detail. The team recounted their experiences, describing the illusions, the data that Lee had partially deciphered, and the horrifying relics of a civilization's downfall. Then they explained the intangible sense that something else had boarded the Caliburn with them. Beckett swallowed hard. "We'll have to quarantine the derelict ship. And us. Warn any other humans away. This monstrosity must never reach our colonies." The Caliburn's engines roared to life, and the vessel slowly pulled away from the floating hulk. The plan was to set demolition charges at long range, obliterating the alien craft so that no further explorers would open the crypt. But as they prepared the charges, the Caliburn's systems began malfunctioning in synchronicity. The monitors displayed loops of strange symbols, ancient scripts pouring across readouts. Lights dimmed, leaving them in the gloom of emergency power. Doors hissed open unpredictably. The words, "older than the stars," repeated in an eerie whisper over the internal comm channels, though none were broadcasting. Then Jensen, a junior officer, vanished while heading to the storage bay for the demolition charges. His frantic shouts echoed fleetingly over the comm, cut off by an unnerving crackle. Search parties found no trace, except for his dropped flashlight, lying in the middle of a corridor that stank of ozone and rotting vegetation. Dripping pipes overhead gave off a slow, anxious drip, 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 as if the Caliburn were bleeding. A sense of violation gripped everyone, like the entire ship was being invaded from within. The entity was feeding on their despair, fracturing their reality. Captain Beckett tried to rally them. "We have to retake control," she said. "Set those charges if we can. Keep your wits about you people." Her words offered fleeting confidence, though each crew member's eyes betrayed absolute fear. Lee and Hill worked feverishly in the dimly lit engineering section, bypassing compromised systems and attempting to restore partial functionality. Alarm klaxons wailed sporadically. The entire environment felt as though it were breathing, inhaling and exhaling thick waves of dread. At times, the oppressive miasma in the corridors formed patterns reminiscent of twisted faces howling in silent agony. It was not simply illusions, but pieces of the lost civilization, or perhaps its tortured spirits, seeping into Caliburn's halls. Vega, leading a small security detail, combed the lower decks searching for Jensen. They found him in the corner of the cargo hold, pressed into a trembling fetal position, whispering in an unknown tongue. His eyes were white, unblinking, locked into a trance. When they tried to move him, he screamed a guttural wail that resonated with the same pitch as the shapeless moan from the derelict. The lights flared, flickered, and died. In that moment of utter blackness, everyone felt a presence overshadow them. Titanic, dreadful, and immeasurable old. When the emergency lighting flickered back on, Jensen was still there, but motionless, unbreathing. His face was etched with pure terror, his skin pallid. Vega touched his neck to check for a pulse and recoiled. Ice cold. The entity had absorbed him completely. Whatever that thing was, it craved more. The temperature in the hold dropped, white frost forming over the metal floor. A mournful whisper drew itself around them, heavy with gloom. The security detail snapped out of their paralysis and retreated, carrying Jensen's body. As they emerged back into the corridor, they realized it was no longer simply about blowing up the derelict. The evil had found a new vessel in the Caliburn. If they didn't act, it would use them to break free, spreading its corruption across the stars. They joined Beckett and the others on the bridge. Anxiety pressed upon them all. Lee informed them the demolition charges were armed on the derelict, but required a manual trigger from the Caliburn. Now, however, the Caliburn's main weapons array was compromised. They would have to override from a secondary console in the observation deck to trigger the remote detonation. But that deck had become a hotbed of activity. Doors opening to reveal nightmarish shadows. One volunteer needed to attempt the override in person, knowing the entity would do anything to stop them. Captain Beckett, determined and grim, volunteered for the mission. She refused to send any more of her people to their doom on a task she considered her own. The others insisted on accompanying her. They would stand a better chance in numbers. Reluctantly, she agreed, and so a team of 5 headed for the observation deck, while the rest stayed on the bridge to keep the ship stable. Descending into the corridors, they listened to the metallic groans of the Caliburn's innards. Lights flickered, revealing fleeting glimpses of alien figures drifting just beyond corners. Sometimes it was illusions of that lost species, other times the whitened face of poor Jensen, mouth agape. The malevolence thickened with every step. Halfway there, the path branched into 3 directions. The overhead signage blinked rapidly, each sign displaying contradictory directions. A stench like burning hair filled the air, though they found no source. Beckett took a careful step. "We stick together," she said in a hushed tone. With no other recourse, they pressed forward, ignoring the illusions. They clung to each other's presence to stay sane. Eventually, they found the door to the observation deck. A faint glow seeped from under it, pulsing like a heartbeat. As they approached, the door slid open on its own. The wide windows once offered a panoramic view of the stars, but now, something writhed in the swirling cosmic dust. The shape was massive, blacker than the void. It had no defined boundaries, yet it felt sentient. It was as though an old cosmic god was peering back through the glass. Il rushed to the override console. Lee tried to assist, but the screens were flooded with alien script. She had to bypass each line of code, fighting unseen interference. Meanwhile, Beckett stared through the window, her reflection blending with the shape outside. She felt telepathic pressure building in her skull, 1,000 alien voices chanting in unison. She clenched her fists, blood roaring in her ears. Suddenly, one of the crew cried out as dark shapes coalesced from the corners of the deck. They formed a procession of twisted silhouettes, skeletal alien bodies swaying, each crowned with that horrifying red glow in their skulls. They advanced like a slow, silent mob, arms outstretched. The air grew frigid. A low rumble shook the deck. Beckett realized they were in the presence of the ancient evil, that it was about to envelop them completely. "Almost there," Lee murmured, sweaty fingers dancing across the console. Sparks erupted as the entity hissed through the system. The corridor behind them was swelling with more ghostly pilgrims, chanting in an incomprehensible language. Their wails crescendoed. Finally, Lee hammered one last command into the panel. "Done," she breathed. "Charges armed and ready." "We just have to press." She never finished. Monstrous wind tore through the observation deck, ripping away chairs, wires, debris. Lee clung to the console, chest pounding. Beckett forced herself to remain upright, ignoring the wailing illusions closing in. She slammed her hand onto the final override. In the same instant, the observation window cracked, spider webs of fractures erupting across the reinforced glass. That swirling darkness outside bulged, pressing closer still. A silent flash lit the void. The derelict vessel, with all the ancient pods and labyrinthine corridors, erupted in a brilliant flare, disintegrating in an immense burst of destruction. For a moment, the swirling darkness at the window let out what felt like an unearthly shriek, resonating in every metal panel. Then it withdrew, drawn involuntarily toward the dying remains of its temple. As the explosion dimmed, the silhouette in the cosmic dust began to dissipate, dissolving into the vacuum. The haunting presence within the Caliburn loosened its grip, though the vestiges of lingering dread remained. One by one, the ghostly figures sloughed away, unraveling like smoke. The lights on the Caliburn stabilized, flickering back to normal brightness. A collective exhalation of relief flooded the room. Lee collapsed to her knees, eyes brimming with tears. Beckett sank into a nearby chair, her breath ragged. The entire ship groaned and rattled but remained intact. They had severed the link between the ancient entity and its cathedral ship. Whatever it was, however powerful, it had been driven back into the cosmic abyss. In the ensuing days, the Caliburn systems recovered under the painstaking care of Lee and Hill. No more apparitions roamed the corridors. The weight of fear lifted, though the memory of their ordeal lingered. Jensen remained a tragic casualty, lost to the entity's consuming terror. The crew held a short memorial, officiated by Beckett, who stood in front of the sealed coffin in silence. The echo of distant stars hummed around them, a reminder of how small humanity was amid ancient cosmic forces. When all was secured, they began their voyage back toward known territory. Their immediate mission was canceled. The unexplored quadrant could wait. They carried an obligation to warn others, never to venture into that region of space again, or, if they did, to be prepared for the nameless horror that might lurk there. Over the following weeks, Vega often woke in a sweat, haunted by nightmares of winding corridors and skeletal apparitions. Sometimes, in the dark stillness of deep space, he thought he felt a faint presence brush against his consciousness, as if testing the locks of a door that remained bolted. But then it would pass, leaving him uncertain whether it had truly been there or only in his mind. He was not alone in his lingering dread. Estrada found herself checking the medbay's shadows at night, half expecting something to peer out. Hill and Lee oversaw seemingly mundane repairs, but the slightest malfunction in the power grid made them flinch. Even Captain Beckett, so stoic on the surface, grew uncharacteristically distant, eyes flicking toward the observation window, as though expecting a monstrous shape to manifest across the stars. Yet, each day the Caliburn survived, pressing gradually onward to safer harbors. In the clasp of that final horizon, with the destroyed vessel miles behind them, they knew that the malevolent energy was not truly gone. Ancient powers dwelt in the void. Perhaps it was trapped again or cast adrift, waiting to be awakened by the next civilization curious enough to pry open its tomb. In the far reaches of a frontier where humans had spread to many worlds, one lesson rang true. Not all lost ships are simply derelict. Some are tombs forged of nightmares, best left to drift forever in the silent darkness, sealed away from those who have yet to learn the dangers hidden among the stars.